I never expected my father's wedding to feel like a funeral. Everyone smiled, dressed in champagne and silk, but the air tasted like secrets. I sat in the back, unwelcome, erased. Then Eva, my 14-year-old niece, rose from her seat, her voice clear, her words sharp. "You don't get to rewrite history just because you bought a prettier chapter." The room fell silent. Eyes turned. Hearts skipped. In that moment, the mask my family wore cracked, and I knew we were no longer playing pretend. I came to mourn my place in this family. I stayed to burn down the lie. The chateau glimmered under strings of golden lights, every stone polished as if history itself had been scrubbed clean. Guests in designer gowns moved like swans across the marble floor, champagne flutes tilted at just the right angle. From a distance, it looked like perfection, a second chance at happiness for a man who had already buried one wife. But standing at the edge of it, my skin prickled. There was no warmth in the air, only the chill of something staged too carefully, as if this wedding were less about love and more about erasure. I arrived late. My cab driver got lost along the winding French countryside roads, but I suspected fate had delayed me on purpose. When I finally stepped out, the cold night hit harder than the chandelier glow spilling from the open doors. Before I could take a step inside, 2 men in black suits blocked my way. "Name?" one asked without looking at me, his accent sharp. "Lauren Carter," I said, voice steadier than I felt. He scrolled through his list, frowned, and shook his head. "Not listed." For a moment, my throat closed. Not listed. Not on the guest list of my father's wedding. As though I had ceased to exist. I was about to argue when a familiar laugh rang out from inside, pulling my attention through the open doorway. My father stood at the center of the grand hall, glass raised, smile broad. Beside him, in a gown of shimmering silver, was my younger sister, Rachel, radiant under his arm. She looked every inch the beloved daughter. His words drifted through the air like poison disguised as honey. "My Rachel, my pride," he said, kissing her temple. Guests clapped politely. No one asked why his eldest child was standing outside, barred like an intruder. Finally, perhaps out of embarrassment rather than compassion, he waved his hand at the guards. "Let her in." I walked past them, their eyes avoiding mine. My heels clicked on the marble, each sound a reminder of the distance between me and the world my father had built without me. Every gaze that turned my way was polite but dismissive, as if I were a guest who had wandered into the wrong reception. The hall smelled of roses and expensive perfume. Strings played a waltz in the background. I scanned the faces until I found Eva. My niece sat stiffly at one of the tables near the back, 14 years old, in a simple dress that looked borrowed. Her eyes were sharp, though, too knowing for her age. When she saw me, her lips trembled into a smile, the only honest expression in the room. I leaned down and kissed her cheek. "You look beautiful," I whispered. "So do you," she said quickly, then glanced at the head table. "Grandpa didn't want you here, did he?" The words stung because they were true. I squeezed her hand. "Doesn't matter. I'm here now." Dinner began, a parade of courses carried out on silver trays. Toasts were made, laughter rehearsed. At one point, my father stood tapping his glass for attention. "Tonight," he began, his voice smooth, "marks the completion of my family. For years I wandered broken, but now I am whole again." His eyes swept across the room, pausing on Rachel, on his new wife beside her, but never once landing on me. The applause that followed was thunderous. Inside, something in me cracked. Beside me, Eva leaned closer to her mother and asked, perhaps too loudly, "Why doesn't Grandpa ever talk about Aunt Lauren?" Silence rippled for a second before the orchestra picked up again. My sister gave her daughter a warning look, but Eva's question hung in the air like smoke. Later, after dessert was cleared, Eva slipped away from her table. I found her in the corridor outside the ballroom, crouched near a sideboard drawer she had tugged open. "Look," she whispered when she saw me. In her small hands, she held a torn photograph. The edges were jagged, as though someone had ripped it apart in anger. On one half, I recognized myself. 7 years old, smiling, my arm wrapped around my mother. On the other half, my mother's face had been sliced away. Ava's eyes widened. Why would someone do this? I didn't answer. My throat was too tight, but I knew the truth. My father had been rewriting history long before this wedding, erasing us piece by piece until only the parts he approved of remained. I was about to take the photo from her when the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. My father appeared, towering in his tuxedo, his smile sharp enough to cut. "Lauren," he said smoothly, though his tone carried iron. "Why are you out here?" "I needed air," I replied, sliding the photograph into my clutch before he noticed. He studied me for a beat too long, then gestured back toward the hall. "Come, sit with the family." I hesitated. Family. The word rang hollow in his mouth. But before I could answer, he reached for my shoulder, guiding me firmly inside. Guests turned their heads as he announced, "My daughter has finally joined us. She belongs here tonight." His smile stretched wide, but his eyes were cold, a performance meant for everyone else. And I realized then, the cage wasn't built from bars. It was built from gold, from applause, from the illusion that everything was perfect. I sat down again, but my heart beat like a trapped bird. For the first time that night, I wondered if the real ceremony wasn't about vows at all, but about burying the last traces of my mother and me. And Eva, across the table, watched me with the same thought written clearly in her young, furious eyes. The longer I stayed at that table, the more the air thickened with something unspoken. Guests smiled at me politely, but leaned their chairs closer to Rachel, their bodies turning away from me like sunflowers to light. I laughed at the jokes, sipped the wine, tried to seem invisible, but invisibility was never enough. My father's gaze cut across the room, and every time our eyes met, I felt like a shadow he wanted to banish. During a lull in conversation, Rachel leaned over, her perfume cloying, her smile sharp. "Lauren," she whispered, her words coated in sugar. "You should probably go. Don't embarrass him tonight. He's finally happy." The sting was sharper than I expected, not because she said it, but because of how gently she did, as if she truly believed my presence was poison. I pushed my fork into the untouched food, swallowing words I wanted to release. Leaving would have been easier, safer, but the truth was I had nowhere to go. Across the hall, Eva sat stiff in her chair, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. At one point, she excused herself to the restroom, but curiosity led her elsewhere. I didn't see it happen, only learned later what she overheard. She had passed the study near the library, pausing when voices drifted through the half-open door. "She's dangerous," my father's voice said, low and venomous. "That girl should have been locked away years ago." My stepmother's laugh was like ice shattering. "Don't worry. Soon she'll be nothing but a memory. Let her try to speak. No one will believe a word." Eva froze, pressing herself against the wall until their voices faded. She never told me in that moment. Instead, her silence grew heavier through the evening, and when our eyes met later, I saw it. Fear, anger, and something else. A secret she wasn't ready to share yet. Later, while wandering toward the back of the hall, she found herself near the grand fireplace. Flames roared, sparks leaping, and standing before it was my stepmother, elegant, even in malice. Eva hid behind a pillar as the woman tossed a folder into the fire. The edges curled instantly, blackening to ash, the words stamped on the front, barely visible before the flames consumed them, read, "Financial records." Eva bit her lips so hard it bled, but she didn't move. She watched until the folder was nothing but ash. That night, she would tell me about it in a whisper, her voice trembling. The mask my family wore was cracking, piece by piece, but what lay beneath was far darker than I had imagined. For years, I had told myself my mother's death was her choice, that the weight of my father's cruelty had finally broken her. But whispers had followed me my whole life, rumors that didn't fit. She had spoken to a lawyer. She had wanted to file for divorce, to take back what was stolen. Then, suddenly, she was gone. She hadn't left us. She had been erased. I excused myself during the final toast, slipping away from the noise, heart pounding with questions. In my father's private office, the door left carelessly unlocked. I rifled through drawers, papers, contracts, polished frames of Rachel and his new wife. But in the back of a cabinet, I found something that made my breath hitch, a copy of my mother's will. It was dated years before her death, and the handwriting was undeniably hers. But when I compared it to the official copy I had seen as a child, something didn't align. The beneficiaries were different. In this version, everything passed to me. But the one the lawyers had read after her death? It had transferred everything to my father, then to his new wife and Rachel. I sat back hard, the paper trembling in my hands. Someone had rewritten my mother's last words. Before I could process it, Eva appeared in the doorway, pale and shaken. She held her phone out to me, a message glowing on the screen. "Be careful. They're not as harmless as you think." The number was blocked, anonymous. My skin prickled. "Who sent this?" I whispered. Eva shook her head, her voice small. "I don't know, but they know something." We barely had a moment to think before a voice cut through the shadows. An older man, one of the staff who had worked for my father for decades, stood at the threshold. His hands trembled as he clutched his cap. "I heard screaming years ago," he said, eyes wet. "I should have spoken, but I stayed silent. I can't carry it anymore." Then he left as suddenly as he appeared, leaving us with the weight of his confession. That night, sleep dragged me under like a tide, but even in dreams, I couldn't escape. I saw my mother standing in the old library, her hair loose, her eyes filled with urgency. She didn't speak, only lifted her hand and pointed toward a row of books. One in particular glowed faintly, as though marked. When I reached for it, the dream dissolved, and I woke with her voice in my ears, not a word, but a plea. Somewhere, hidden, she had left the truth, and now, piece by piece, the lies were beginning to burn. The ballroom shimmered with gold and glass, every detail rehearsed, every smile painted. Guests filled their seats as the orchestra swelled, the bride floating down the aisle like a vision in ivory lace. My father stood waiting, tall and assured, his hand already extended as if he were claiming victory rather than beginning a marriage. When the vows were finished, he turned toward the microphone. "I know I've made mistakes," he began, his voice slow, deliberate, commanding. "But life grants second chances. Tonight I stand beside the woman who completes me. After all the years of pain, I have chosen rightly this time." The audience broke into applause. Some dabbed their eyes, convinced by his performance. My chest tightened, my fingers itched to rise, to tear through the silence with the truth. I started to stand, words forming at the back of my throat. But before I could take a step, 2 security guards shifted, blocking my path. Their polite smiles hid steel. "Not now," one murmured. I sank back into my chair, rage buzzing under my skin. That's when Eva stood. The room stilled at once, the orchestra cutting off mid-note, a 14-year-old girl in a pale dress, trembling but defiant, her voice carrying further than anyone expected. "You're lying," she said, her words slicing clean through the air. "You don't get to stand up here and pretend." Gasps erupted. My father froze, the practiced smile flickering. "Sit down, Eva," he ordered, his voice low but laced with warning. But Eva didn't move. She reached into her small purse, her hands shaking. "I found this," she said, holding up a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. "A letter. From Grandma." My heart stopped. The room exploded in whispers. Guests craned their necks, eager, scandalized. My stepmother's face drained of color, then flooded with a cold, furious red. "Enough!" my father barked, stepping forward. "Give that to me!" Eva's grip tightened. "No! Everyone deserves to know what really happened." Chaos rippled through the crowd. Chairs scraping, cameras lifting, voices overlapping. Some begged for calm, others leaned closer, their hunger for spectacle greater than their discomfort. "Eva!" I rushed toward her, but security intercepted me, rough hands gripping my arms. I twisted against them, eyes locked on my niece, terrified she was in danger but unable to reach her. "Ungrateful brat," my father snarled, no longer bothering with the mask. "You think you understand anything?" It was the first time I had ever seen him lose control in public. His mask slipped fully, revealing the man I had always known behind closed doors. The whispers turned into judgmental stares. "Don't you dare!" my stepmother shrieked, her voice breaking, hysteria bleeding into every syllable. "She's just like her aunt, crazy, unstable, just like her mother." The words sliced me open. My breath caught, my fists trembling against the guards. For a moment, the room swayed. All I heard was the echo of my mother's sobs. All I saw was her face erased from photographs, erased from memory. And then, another sound. A crackle. The projection screen at the back of the ballroom flickered to life. At first, it seemed like a technical error, static disrupting the illusion of perfection. But then the image sharpened, grainy and raw. A video clip, old but undeniable. My father and stepmother, younger, in the middle of a vicious argument. Her voice filled the room, sharp as glass. "You can't just lock her away, Robert. People will ask questions." His reply was venom. "She's unstable. No one will believe her. We'll call it treatment, call it mercy. When she's gone, no one will question us." The ballroom fell into stunned silence. My stomach twisted, bile rising. Around me, gasps turned to cries, whispers turned to horror. The illusion shattered in an instant. The family image he had built, the empire of respectability, cracked under the weight of his own words. Eva clutched the letter tighter, tears streaking her face, but her chin lifted in defiance. "You hurt her," she said, voice breaking, "and you tried to erase her. But you can't erase me." The guards holding me faltered, unsure now, their grip loosening. I wrenched free, rushing to Eva's side. She collapsed into my arms, shaking, but I held her steady. My father's face twisted, fury and fear colliding. He opened his mouth to speak, to regain control, but the crowd was no longer listening. Guests pulled out their phones, recording, broadcasting, ensuring the truth couldn't be buried again. In that moment, the ceremony transformed into something else entirely. Not a wedding, not a celebration, but an unmasking. The applause had died, the music silenced, the lies burned away under the glare of truth. And as I stood there, clutching Eva, I realized there was no going back. The world now knew what I had always lived with. The cage had cracked. The poison had spread too far to contain. For the first time in years, my father looked small, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to look him in the eye. We didn't go home that night. After the chaos, the shouting, the video playing for the world to see, neither of us could face the family estate again. Instead, Ava and I slipped into a taxi, our bodies still trembling with adrenaline, and headed to the only place I thought might hold answers. The old hotel where my mother had stayed in the final months before she disappeared. The building looked almost forgotten, its once grand facade faded and chipped. But as I stepped into the dimly lit lobby, I felt her presence everywhere, like her laughter and her sorrow had soaked into the walls. The clerk, an old man with tired eyes, seemed to recognize me at once. "You look like her," he said softly, sliding a tarnished key across the counter. "Room 312. She stayed there often." We climbed the creaking staircase, every step weighted with dread. The room was small, but still carried traces of her. The wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the scent of old paper lingered. Beneath the bed, tucked inside a wooden box, Eva found it, a small chest lined with velvet. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside were letters, journals, and cassette tapes wrapped in yellowed ribbon. I picked one at random, the ink faded but legible. "My darling Lauren," it read, "if you're reading this, it means I failed to protect you. But remember, it wasn't your fault. It was never your fault." Tears blurred the words. All my life, I had carried the weight of her silence as though it were proof of weakness. But here, in her own handwriting, she had freed me. I pressed the letter to my chest and whispered, "It wasn't your fault, Mom, and it wasn't mine." Eva placed a cassette into an old recorder we found in the box. Static crackled, then a voice filled the room, my father's, venomous and unmistakable. "If you don't sign, I'll make sure your daughter pays. I swear I'll make her regret ever being born." I dropped the recorder, my stomach heaving. The words echoed in my head, a poison I had unknowingly swallowed my whole life. It wasn't just cruelty, it was a threat, a promise. Eva clutched my hand tightly, her young face pale but resolute. "Now you know," she whispered. "Now you can fight." I stared at her, realizing she wasn't just my niece. She was my witness, my partner, my echo of truth. For anyone who has ever been told their pain wasn't real, who has been painted as unstable simply for speaking out, you would see yourself in me then. You would understand the storm rising in my chest, the rage and the clarity merging into fire. By morning, I had made my decision. Running had never saved my mother. Silence had never saved me. But the truth, spoken loudly, relentlessly, might save Ava. I gathered every document, every recording, every scrap of evidence, and scanned them onto my laptop. Then I sent the files to a journalist I knew, one who had never bowed to pressure or money. In the email, I wrote only, "My father is not the man he claims to be. This is the truth. Publish if you dare." Eva, meanwhile, scoured the journals, and in one of them she found a name repeatedly mentioned, Daniel Price. With some digging, we discovered he was an old friend of my mother, a lawyer who had once specialized in human rights cases. He had tried to help her before, until suddenly he too vanished from our lives. When we finally tracked him down, his hair had gone silver, but his voice carried the same fire. "I always knew she didn't take her own life," he said, gripping my hands. "I still have the original copy of her will. They forged the one that was read in court." The ground shifted beneath me. "It's still valid?" I asked. He nodded grimly. "Yes, unless someone destroys it. But I hid it well." It was a twist I hadn't dared hope for, proof that my mother had wanted me to inherit everything, not them. Proof that the empire they had built was stolen from her ashes. The rage I felt then wasn't wild anymore. It was focused, sharp, strategic. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about revenge. It was about burning down the system of abuse that had thrived unchecked, about showing the world that even the most polished lies could rot from within. I looked at Eva, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce despite her youth. "We're not just taking back what was stolen," I said. "We're ending this once and for all." She squeezed my hand. "Then let's make them listen." That night, as the city outside the window slept, I stared at the letters one last time. My mother had been silenced, erased, buried beneath lies, but through me, through Eva, through the evidence she had left behind, her voice would rise again. And for the first time, I felt not like a victim, but like a warrior rising from fire. A phoenix, wings spreading, ready to choose my own game. The article broke at dawn, its headline cut sharper than any blade. "Prestigious family hid generational abuse behind wealth and power." Screens across the city lit up with my father's name, his face, his carefully polished reputation shattered in black ink. Every detail was there: the forged will, the threats, the recordings Eva and I had uncovered. The truth that had been buried for decades now screamed across the front page. Within hours, social media erupted. The clip of Eva standing at the wedding, her small voice defying him, "You're lying," circulated faster than wildfire. Strangers from every corner of the world shared it, calling her brave, calling her a symbol of resistance. To them, she was a girl who had broken silence, but to me, she was the reason I could breathe again. By evening, reporters gathered outside my apartment, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Questions poured in, desperate and relentless. But I stayed inside, clutching the evidence like a lifeline, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and relief. The silence between each knock on the door felt longer, heavier. Then came the pounding, hard, frantic fists against the wood. Eva froze, her eyes wide. When I opened the door, I didn't find the press. I found my stepmother. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks, her silk dress wrinkled, her body trembling like a child in a storm. "Lauren," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I didn't know how far he would go. Please, you have to believe me. I never wanted any of this." For a moment, pity cracked my chest, but then I remembered the laughter, the whispers, the fire where she had thrown my mother's records. I remembered her voice calling me insane, unstable, just like my mother. "You helped him," I said coldly. "You kept his secrets. You erased us." Her tears flowed harder, but her words slipped too quickly, too rehearsed. "It was Rachel. She pushed him. She told him what to do. She's been controlling him for years." The twist hit me like ice water. "Rachel?" She nodded, desperate. "She forged the will. She managed the accounts. She made him believe you were the enemy. He trusted her more than anyone." I slammed the door in her face before she could say more. My hands shook as I locked it, turning back to Eva, who stood in stunned silence. "Rachel," I whispered. The word tasted bitter. My sister, my blood, the child who had been placed on a pedestal while I was thrown into the shadows. She wasn't just favored, she had been pulling the strings all along. The collapse came quickly after that. Investigations swarmed the family estate. Lawyers demanded records, banks froze accounts. Reporters dug deeper, uncovering decades of bribes and falsified documents. Rachel's composure cracked first. Cameras caught her storming from a courthouse, screaming at journalists, her mask slipping into raw hysteria. Within days, she was charged with fraud, accused of forging my mother's will and funneling funds into hidden accounts. My father didn't fare better. He was summoned by investigators, forced to answer for the recordings, the threats, the false reports he had filed. The man who had once commanded rooms with charm now stumbled through the hallways, his shoulders hunched, his eyes empty. For the first time in my life, he looked old, small, broken. The family that had once stood as untouchable crumbled like ash in rain. Relatives cut ties, associates fled. The empire they had built on lies collapsed beneath the weight of truth. And yet, even as the dust settled, I felt no triumph, only clarity. I stood before the cameras one afternoon, Eva by my side. Her hand trembled in mine, but her chin was raised, her eyes unflinching. Reporters shouted questions, demanding vengeance, demanding blood. Eva spoke first, her voice steady despite the storm. "We don't want revenge," she said, her words echoing louder than any verdict. "We want freedom. We want to live without fear. We want to be believed." The crowd fell silent, struck by the simplicity of her truth. I looked at her then, this girl who had become my compass, and realized she had said everything I couldn't. Justice wasn't about punishing them. It was about breaking the chains they had wrapped around us for so long. Behind us, the city hummed with noise, but for that moment, all I heard was her voice. All I felt was the weight lifting from my chest. The day of reckoning had come, not with vengeance, not with fire, but with the undeniable power of truth. And the family that once silenced us had finally been silenced themselves. The months that followed were strange, quiet in ways I had never known. The storm of scandal faded into a steady hum of aftermath. My father and Rachel remained entangled in courts and investigations, their empire reduced to dust. For once, my name wasn't whispered in scorn, but spoken with something closer to respect. I poured my grief, my rage, and my liberation into words. The book came almost too easily, pages flowing late into the night, every memory sharpened by years of silence. I called it The Family That Burned Truth. When it hit shelves, I expected little, but within weeks it soared to the bestseller list, devoured by people who saw themselves in my story. Letters poured in, survivors thanking me for naming what they had been told was unspeakable. Eva found her own voice too. Reporters wanted her face, her words. At first, I shielded her, afraid the weight would crush her, but she insisted. "I want people to know it doesn't matter how old you are," she said firmly. "You can still tell the truth." And so she became an advocate, a 14-year-old with the fire of someone who had carried centuries of silence on her back. She spoke in schools, in interviews, her message simple but searing. Being young doesn't make you invisible. Life felt almost whole again, but one evening, as I signed books at a small store in New York, a woman stepped forward in line. She was maybe in her late 20s, her eyes dark, her mouth set in determination. "You don't know me," she said quietly when she reached my table. "But we share the same father." The world tilted beneath me, my pen stilled in my hand. "My name is Claire," she continued. "He left my mother before I was born. He never acknowledged me. But I've watched everything unfold, and I think you deserve to know I exist." 1,000 emotions collided inside me: anger, sorrow, a strange relief. I had spent my life thinking I was unwanted, unloved, alone in the shadow of Rachel. Now, here stood proof that even his hidden sins had left behind fragments of family. Claire leaned closer, her voice lowering to a whisper. "I know more than you think, more than you've written. Things he did, things Rachel planned, things they never wanted anyone to discover." Her words were a blade wrapped in velvet, and I felt the promise of yet another truth waiting in the dark. For the first time, I didn't flinch. "Then tell me everything," I said. That night, I lay awake, the micro cliffhanger of her revelation echoing in my mind. I had thought the story was finished, but perhaps truth never truly ends. It keeps unfolding, demanding to be seen. In the months that followed, I turned my energy outward. With the book's success came opportunities, and I chose to build something lasting. I opened a center for survivors of emotional and familial abuse, a place where voices couldn't be silenced, where no one would ever be told they were imagining things. Walking through its doors for the first time, I felt the weight of my mother's presence, as if she approved. Eva thrived. She stood on stages with lights in her eyes and conviction in her voice. At a TED Talk, she spoke words that broke the audience into tears. "I was the only child in my family who was ever trusted to speak my feelings, and I will make sure no other child has to fight that hard just to be heard." The crowd rose to their feet, applause thunderous. I sat in the back, tears slipping down my face, pride swelling so fierce it nearly broke me. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the windows of the center, I pinned a single photo to the wall. My mother, young and smiling, holding me in her arms. No caption, no plaque. Just her face, unerased at last. The silence around the photo spoke louder than words. For years I had been told I was broken, unstable, unworthy of truth. But standing there, surrounded by survivors who carried the same scars, I finally understood. We were never broken. We were just never believed. So I leave you with this, the message that carried me through fire and into freedom. You are not crazy. You're just finally seeing the truth.